James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. General Murillo, having advanced from the frontiers of Portugal towards Cáceres in Spanish Extremadura for the dual purpose of recruiting and securing supplies for the 5th Spanish Army under his command, soon found his progress challenged. Upon learning of Murillo's movements, Count d'Erlon immediately detached General Gerard with a division of the 5th French Corps and a considerable body of cavalry from Mérida to halt Murillo's advance. The opposing forces caught sight of each other a short distance from Cáceres, but no serious confrontation ensued. Murillo, realizing his force was vastly outnumbered and outmatched in discipline, prudently withdrew his troops towards Malpartida and later to Arroyo del Puerco and Aliseda. Once this information reached Lord Wellington, he swiftly ordered General Hill to advance and push the enemy behind the Guadiana River. General Hill accordingly broke camp from his cantonments at Portalegre on the 22nd of October, moving with a portion of his troops toward the frontier. 2 leagues from Portalegre they passed Alegrete, the last Portuguese town in that direction, and after 3 more leagues arrived at Codicera, the first Spanish village. There, under torrential rain, they bivouacked. Many of the officers, lightly equipped for marching, were poorly prepared for such conditions. A few, who were especially ill-provisioned, huddled around a blazing fire, each resting their head on the legs of the man in front, trying to find some comfort despite being 2/3 frozen and 1/3 roasted. The following morning, the force advanced to Albuquerque, an ancient city on the northern slope of the Sierra de Montanches. Above the town stands a castle, weathered and aged, which must have stood tall since before the introduction of gunpowder. Commanding a strategic position, it could become a useful military station if it had access to a reliable water supply. On the 24th, the brigade, along with 3 pieces of Portuguese artillery, advanced to Cantillana. The next morning, they pushed another league forward to Aliseda, where they found the 3rd Brigade, 3 more artillery pieces, and some Spanish cavalry under the command of Colonel Downey. The road between Cantillana and Aliseda was in such poor condition that the guns had to be dismounted and carried by hand up a steep incline by the brigade. Upon arriving at Aliseda, they were immediately ordered to cook with haste. This proved to be an ominous command, often signalling an impending long march, sharp battle, or both. At that time, the bullocks, which were to serve as their meal, were still freely roaming around, but in less than an hour they were bubbling in the camp kettles. As the soldiers sat down to eat, the bugle called them to arms, forcing them to gulp down their nearly boiling soup as quickly as they could. "This is comfortable work for a cold day," I remarked to a friend as we swallowed the scorching liquid. "True," he replied, "but wouldn't it be better if we could lift the veil and see what the future holds?" I responded. "Quite the opposite. It is better that an all-wise Providence conceals the future from us." Leaving Aliseda around 4 in the afternoon, the weather initially felt mild, but as the sun sank, the clouds darkened, and soon the heavens opened, pouring relentless rain as we trudged through the night toward Malpartida. Even in fine summer weather, marching at night is unpleasant. How much worse it was for the soldiers in the pitch-black, stormy night, wading through several inches of mud and water. Every few steps, feet sank into ruts or bumped into stones, throwing the men off balance and sending them sprawling into puddles. This miserable march continued throughout the night, and by dawn on the 26th, many soldiers were so exhausted that had the enemy been further away, they would likely have collapsed where they stood, waiting for daylight to guide them forward. The enemy, however, had slipped away before dawn, retreating from Malpartida, The German hussars were sent in pursuit of the fleeing French, who retreated to Cáceres and later to Torremocha. With no immediate opportunity to engage the French, General Hill ordered the troops to take cover in Malpartida. Early on the 27th, the offensive resumed, and upon finding that the French had withdrawn from Torremocha to Arroyo del Molinos, the troops marched first to Aldea del Cano, then to Casa de Don Antonio, and finally forced a march to Alcuesca, just 3 miles from Arroyo del Molinos. Determined to attack at dawn, the troops, except for the 71st Regiment, were bivouacked behind the village, out of sight of the enemy, and no fires were allowed. The 71st Regiment, stationed in Alcuesca, set up piquets around the village to prevent spies or any disloyal individuals from informing Gerard of their movements. As night fell, the rain poured down in torrents, drenching the troops who settled down to rest without complaint, bearing their hardships like true soldiers. At 2 in the morning on the 28th, sergeants quietly woke their men, whispering for them to prepare for action. Absolute silence was crucial to ensure the success their general anticipated. It took only a few minutes to mobilize the column, and soon after the men saw the enemy's fires in the distance. This sight elated the soldiers, as it meant the enemy had not fled. Despite being only 3 miles apart, the march took 4 hours due to the rough terrain, darkness, and relentless rain. The troops moved as one column until they reached a point half a mile from Arroyo del Molinos, where they closed ranks under the cover of a small hill and formed columns of attack. The left column, under Lieutenant Colonel Stewart of the 50th Regiment, consisted of the 1st Brigade, 50th, 71st, and 92nd Regiments, 1 company of the 60th Rifles, and 3 field pieces. The right column, led by Major General Howard, included the 28th, 34th, and 39th Regiments, another company of the 60th Rifles, the 6th Portuguese Infantry, the 6th Portuguese Caçadores, 2 field pieces, and a howitzer. The centre column, composed of the 9th and 13th Light Dragoons, 2nd German Hussars, and Conde de Pen Villamour's Spanish cavalry, was commanded by Sir William Erskine. General Murillo and his Spanish infantry supported the left column. The left column entered the village swiftly, clearing it with bayonets, catching the enemy completely off guard. Unfortunately, 1 French brigade had already left for Medellin before the British arrived, but the remaining French troops, who were in the process of filing out of the village, were stopped by the sound of British cheers. Seeing escape was impossible without a fight, General Gerard turned his forces around and hastily prepared for battle. His infantry formed 2 squares on the roads leading to Mérida and Medellin, while their cavalry protected the left flank. The 71st Regiment positioned itself on the left, firing from behind garden walls, while the 92nd Regiment formed a line and prepared to charge. However, they were under orders not to fire, a frustrating command as they watched their comrades fall. Still, the Highlanders showed remarkable restraint and awaited the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, artillery fire rained down on the French squares, wreaking havoc and sowing chaos. When the moment finally came, the Highlanders charged, but the French, unwilling to engage, turned and fled toward a steep hill behind them, hoping to find safety. General Howard's forces, meanwhile, manoeuvred around the French left, cutting off their escape routes. The cavalry charged repeatedly, cutting off the French cavalry from their infantry and capturing all of their artillery. Left with 2 terrible options, unconditional surrender or a dangerous flight across the mountains, General Gerard chose the latter, retreating to the most inaccessible part of the hill, where his troops fired down at the British from behind rocks. General Howard pushed the French with the 28th and 34th Regiments, while the 39th and Colonel Ashworth's Portuguese troops moved to flank the French. Murillo's Spaniards also began to climb the hill, prepared to capture the fleeing enemy. Surrounded and desperate, many French soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to escape, but seeing no way out, a white flag was eventually raised, signalling surrender. The remaining French troops continued their retreat, but General Hill, needing to give his troops rest, left the pursuit to General Murillo, who followed the fleeing French for 20 miles, killing many and capturing more. In this well-executed operation, British losses were remarkably low: 7 killed, 57 wounded, and 1 officer, Lieutenant Strenuitz, missing. The French, however, suffered significant losses, with General Brune, Colonel Prince d'Arenberg, 2 lieutenant colonels, 30 other officers, and around 1,300 soldiers captured. All their artillery, money, and provisions were taken by the British. The French also suffered heavy casualties in the retreat, with over 600 found dead in the woods and mountains, and the force, originally numbering 3,100, was reduced to just 300 men, including their wounded commander. After the prisoners were secured, the British troops moved to San Pedro, 2 leagues from Arroyo del Molinos. Shortly after, a party of 23 French dragoons was spotted fleeing towards Medellin. A piquet of 17 British cavalrymen swiftly intercepted them, and after a brief skirmish, the French dragoons surrendered. The following morning, the British left St. Pedro and marched for 15 hours through torrential rain before reaching Merida, exhausted and hungry. After a day of rest, they sold the captured horses, mules and asses at auction, along with the money found in General Gerard's military chest, to be distributed among the troops. With their mission in Extremadura completed, the British forces withdrew to Montejo on the 31st of October and arrived in Campo Mayor on the 1st of November. The 7-league march was broken by a rest stop, where, drenched from crossing a river, the troops found warmth by a fire and drank grog. But just after resuming their march, they encountered another river, even deeper and more rapid, soaking them to the neck. This mistake, standing in water so deep, was a source of frustration and concern, as such exposures often led to sickness and death among the soldiers. The troops spent the 2nd of November in Campo Mayor before moving to Aranches, an old fortress, and finally returning to Port Alegre on the 4th, welcomed with cheers from the grateful populace. Thus ended their memorable expedition into Spain, a success far exceeding the expectations of both the planners and the soldiers who executed it. The victory was a testament to the soldiers' patience, endurance, and valor, which allowed General Hill to overcome every obstacle in his path. If General Gerard needed proof that it is easier to prevent a surprise than to recover from the effects of this most unfortunate of military disasters, the events of the 28th of October would have provided him with ample evidence. History is filled with examples of similar surprises, but few, if any, illustrate an officer resting in more dangerous complacency than General Gerard did on this occasion. Upon being informed that British troops were advancing toward the town in battle formation, Gerard, still in bed, raised himself on his elbow and responded, "Pooh, pooh, the English troops will not march on a morning like this." He then returned to his slumber. One of the gravest errors a military officer can make is to allow himself to be surprised. When a general loses a battle, his honor and reputation remain intact, provided he has carried out his duties with diligence and integrity. However, when a general, through carelessness or a gross neglect of his responsibilities, allows himself to be surprised and defeated, the consequences are far worse. Though any general may have the laurels torn from his brow, regardless of his military prowess, it is rare for such a general to face disgrace if he has taken every possible measure to prevent a surprise and does not leave anything to chance. Fortune, if trusted too far, may prove treacherous, as it did for General Gerard at Arroyo del Molinos, leading to defeat and an overwhelming burden of disgrace for him and his followers. Military history provides a long list of commanders who, by overestimating their abilities and disregarding the advice of more junior officers, have led their troops into perilous situations. Unfortunately, General Gerard must be added to this list. His conduct at Arroyo del Molinos should serve as a warning to all officers of the dangers posed by even the slightest neglect of duty. It should also remind them of the folly of rejecting the advice of a more experienced or talented subordinate simply because that person holds a lower rank. The necessity of thoroughly training British troops in all aspects of field and camp duties before they leave their homeland was made starkly clear during our bivouac at Codicera on the 22nd of October. As soon as our arms were stacked, the veteran soldiers immediately dispersed into the woods, searching for necessities. In contrast, the new recruits, whom we referred to as Johnny Raws, huddled together on their knapsacks, shivering and waiting for fire, water, and food to be provided without any effort on their part. The results of this ignorance were quickly evident. While the experienced soldiers were already sitting down to dinner 2 hours later, the new recruits had not yet managed to get their camp kettles over the fire. It would be unfair, however, to place any blame on these young men for their lack of knowledge. Untrained in field cooking and other camp duties, what else could be expected of them? But should British soldiers be allowed to embark for foreign lands in such an unprepared state? Instead, they should be regularly marched to a suitable location near their barracks, where they can encamp and be taught all the camp duties they might be required to perform in the face of the enemy. After receiving this training, they would return to their quarters in the evening. Such a system is essential, as it is largely due to ignorance of field cooking and how to protect oneself from the elements that so many of our best and bravest soldiers are rushed to the hospital during the early stages of a campaign. While some individuals might grumble at the added duties, these would be few in number, as most officers and soldiers would gladly endure some inconvenience at home in exchange for better health and comfort while on foreign service. On the 27th of October, as we crossed a vast plain between Malpartida and Aldea del Cano, the troops were greatly entertained by the mounted officers of the corps. The officers, having accidentally startled a hare, immediately set the greyhounds after it. The little, timid, short-legged creature ran desperately for its life, but, despite all its cunning, eventually fell prey to its many pursuers. The soldiers were thoroughly amused by the sport, and the officers, noticing this, continued coursing in earnest, entertaining their comrades, until the column reached the edge of the plain. Though this may seem a small gesture, it had a far greater impact on the men's morale than even the most optimistic had anticipated. Time passed so quickly that by the time the column reached Alcuesca, many of the soldiers believed they had marched only half the actual distance. This shows how beneficial it can be when officers find harmless ways to amuse their troops. The 34th French Infantry had already made it to the battlefield at Arroyo, while their commandant was still in his quarters when we passed through the town. He mounted his horse shortly after, determined to rejoin his regiment or die in the attempt. Colonel Cadogan of the 71st Regiment, seeing him galloping down one of the main streets, attempted to stop him. However, while trying to strike the French officer, Cadogan failed to defend himself, allowing his opponent to return the blow. If not for the sturdy materials of Cadogan's headgear, his skull might have been cleaved in two. The gallant Frenchman was captured, and having shown great kindness to British officers who had previously been his prisoners, he was treated with similar respect at Portalegre. As a further reward for his humanity, upon arriving in England, he was permitted to return to his family in France. If all officers treated their captives this way, the horrors of war would be greatly reduced, and much of the cruelty that too often mars the actions of men in battle would be eliminated. The number of soldiers who have narrowly escaped death in battle would, if collected and published, make for a fascinating volume. Buttons, penknives, stocks, pencil cases, keys, watches, combs, sword handles, and even pieces of paper have been recorded as instruments used by divine providence to save the lives of countless soldiers. One such soldier was Colonel Cameron of the 92nd Regiment. Early in the battle, after the captain of the Grenadier Company was wounded, the senior lieutenant assumed command but made an error in his movements. The colonel, greatly irritated, repeated his previous orders in a thunderous voice. In his usual manner when displeased, he struck his chest with his right hand, which held the hilt of his sword. Just as he finished giving the order and his hand hit his chest, a bullet fired by an enemy rifleman struck the first joint of his middle finger, shattering the bone, then passed through the sword hilt and hit his chest. The impact was so strong that the colonel handed command of the battalion to Major Mitchell, believing the bullet had entered his body. Upon realizing his mistake, however, the colonel quickly returned to his men, and despite his middle finger hanging by a small piece of skin and blood pouring from the wound, he led his Highlanders to the end of the engagement. A few days before the Battle of Arroyo del Molinos, a simple-minded private named Brown lost his musket, but could not explain how or where. His commanding officer, enraged, ordered that Brown be sent into the next battle unarmed. The captain of Brown's company, feeling sorry for the poor man, told him to fall back when they neared the village of Arroyo. But the proud soldier refused this act of kindness. He stayed in the ranks throughout the entire engagement. When Captain D had noticed some muskets lying on the ground, he told Brown to take one. But Brown replied, "Colonel Cameron, having ordered me into action without arms, I will remain unarmed until the battle is over, or poor Jack Brown is sent into the next world." True to his word, the heroic fool kept his resolution to the end. The commanding officer, believing that 5 of us who had accompanied the detachment from Ireland properly belonged to the 2nd Battalion, applied to Lord Wellington upon our return to Portalegre for permission to send us home. Leave being granted, we parted with our friends at Portalegre on the 22nd of November, after mutual expressions of regret, and proceeded to Gaffeta. The next day we moved to Gavao, but finding an officer there arranging quarters for Colonel O'Callaghan and the 1st Battalion of the 39th Regiment, we immediately departed for Villafranca, a small village 2 leagues from Abrantes. As we approached the residence of the Chief Magistrate to secure billets, this worthy figure displayed his delight at our arrival by slamming the door in our faces. Angered by this insult, we may have resorted to a more direct method of meeting with this fine gentleman, had it not been for a kind and ladylike woman who introduced herself and graciously offered us the hospitality of her rural home for the night. After offering our heartfelt thanks to our generous patroness and her family, we took our leave the following morning and made our way to Abrantes. After stowing away our baggage and setting everything in order for dinner, we spent a couple of hours strolling through the streets and ramparts of Abrantes. We returned to headquarters expecting a comforting meal of soup and a beefsteak, but instead we were greeted by 2 servants wearing grim expressions and lamenting their tales of woe, which, although pitiable, were no substitute for dinner. Frustrated, we set to work, and through a combination of threats and pleas, managed to obtain a few cooking utensils that had been stubbornly withheld from our servants. Our misfortune, however, was not yet over. Just as everything was ready, the unpleasant couple refused to provide us with a single piece of crockery to serve the food. If the artist Cruikshank had witnessed the comical sight of the husband and wife standing guard over their precious stoneware, she at one cupboard and he at the other, he would have found an ideal subject for his pencil. Truly, they resembled inhabitants of pandemonium more than any worldly beings. On the 26th, after securing our baggage animals, we embarked at Abrantes in a small commissariat boat. With a gentle breeze, we sailed smoothly down the majestic Tagus until nightfall made it unsafe to continue. We landed near the clean and charming village of Chamuska, where we were met with true hospitality. The following day, we sailed down to Vallada, where on the 28th we transferred to a larger boat and, after an uncomfortable night, arrived at daybreak at the Black Horse Square in Lisbon. On the 2nd of December, thousands of handbills were circulated around Lisbon, announcing that at 1 o'clock the next day, a British officer wearing cork boots would walk across the Tagus from Fort Belem to the nearest point of land on the opposite shore. Thinking this was the plan of some reckless or despondent individual seeking to end his life with Neptune's help, I walked down to Belem to witness the day's spectacle. By 11 o'clock, the streets from the city to Belem were filled with people of all nations and classes, from peers to peasants, hurrying to the starting point, some on foot, others in every kind of conveyance, from humble donkeys to grand carriages with 4 horses. Inside Belem Fort I had a clear view of the bustling scene. The fort was packed with officers and ladies, Belem Castle was crowded with Portuguese nobility, and the entire area between the fort and castle was swarming with carriages, riders and pedestrians. At one point I counted 450 carriages. The river, too, was crowded with boats filled with people, many of whom wore the naval and military uniforms of Old England. Prices for boat rentals soared from the usual fare of 2 shillings to as high as $10. As the clock struck 1, the eager crowd on shore began to jostle and push, desperate to catch a glimpse of the officer before his daring feat. The Portuguese militia stationed to keep a pathway clear struggled to hold their ground. Soon after, a voice called out, announcing the hero's approach, but it was a false alarm. 2 o'clock came and went, still no sign of him. 3 o'clock passed, but he did not appear. Eventually, hunger and the fresh Tagus breeze began to wear on the crowd and people started to drift away. By 4 o'clock, most of the 40,000 to 50,000 spectators had returned home, feeling duped and vowing revenge on the British officer and his cork boots. On the evening of the 4th of December, I received a letter recalling me to duty from my commanding officer. After bidding farewell to my friends in the 2nd Battalion, I embarked early the next morning at Belem with a detachment recently arrived from England. After another uncomfortable night, we landed at Vallada the next day at noon. On the 7th, we marched to Santarém, on the 8th to Galegao, the 9th to Punhete, and the 10th to Abrantes, where we rested on the 11th and 12th. On the 13th, we proceeded to Gavao, the 14th to Gafeta, and the following morning we were warmly welcomed back to Portalegre by our comrades. That concludes the 3rd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.